Just imagine for a second. It's 2003, you're walking to the video game aisle at Walmart so you can play whatever new exciting demo they have on the GameCube station, when suddenly a glow emanating from the PS2 section catches your eye. The struggle of where to focus your attention clouds your judgment, so you let go of that slimy GameCube controller that's probably never been cleaned, and you drift towards the light. The beat of the generic pop music playing from the speakers grows louder and louder as you get closer to the glass. Your mind starts racing. What could it be? What could it be? And there it is. Devil May Cry 2. You remember how great the first game was, so of course you're going to add this one to your collection. But little did you know that you're about to purchase one of the video games of all time. Now, this never happened to me personally because I played through this game for the first time like 3 months ago after downloading it on my PS5, but it's fun to imagine things sometimes. Now, if you're familiar with the Devil May Cry series, then you probably already know about the negative attention the second game in the franchise gets for how bad it executes basically everything. But is it actually that bad? Well, I'm a firm believer that there's no such thing as a bad game. Matter of fact, for every game that exists, there's definitely at least one person who enjoys it. Me personally, I enjoy a lot of bad games. Duke Nukem Forever was littered with potty humor, but it was still really fun blasting aliens with ridiculous weapons. And South Park Snow Day is actually a good roguelite with the typical South Park humor that you would expect, even though it's not the other South Park games. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that I treat video games as an entertainment medium. So if I'm entertained, then the game did its job. How profane, right? I think this idea has been lost in the gaming community for a long time, but that's a conversation for another day. So my issue with Devil May Cry 2 is that I'm not sure if I actually enjoyed the time I spent playing the game, which has never happened to me before. I mean, yeah, I did spend so many hours grinding for the platinum, but I think that's more because I'm addicted to the trophy unlock sound effect and not, oh boy, this game was fun, let me play it 4 more times on every difficulty so I can have even more fun. You know what I mean. But why was I able to have fun with Duke Nukem Forever and South Park Snow Day, but not Devil May Cry 2? Well, that's what I'm going to try to figure out today. Let's take a look at Duke Nukem Forever for a second. It was a game that was in development hell for 14 years, went through a few different reworks, and was almost abandoned entirely until Gearbox came along and saved the day. And what released was a super mid first-person shooter with a weak story and basic gunplay. So after waiting 14 years and being served mid with a side of mid, I can understand the sentiment around it being a bad game, but there's nothing inherently wrong with the game. And honestly, it's a great game to shut your brain off and just have fun. South Park Snow Day, on the other hand, is a game that unfortunately suffers from the immense success of its predecessors. Unjustifiably so in my opinion, considering it was made and published by different companies than the RPGs, and Matt Stone was very upfront with what kind of game Snow Day was, but I'm getting lost in the sauce here. Both of these games drew strong comparisons to previous games that shared the same namesakes, which makes sense, because it's only fair that a game that has a 2 slapped on the cover gets compared to the games that came before it. So now, let's take a look at the first Devil May Cry for a second. A woman named Trish shows up to this devil hunter shop, whose name is Dante, and requests his help to defeat Mundus, the devil who runs the demon world. Mundus' operation is taking place on Malay Island, so the two of them head out to stop Mundus before things get out of hand. Trish is like AFK the entire game, while Dante runs around this gothic mansion that's on the island, which is full of unique and powerful enemies that can and will cause a game over screen if you're not paying enough attention. Dante stylishly hacks and slashes his way to Mundus, while utilizing crazy strong weapons and abilities that make you feel like the coolest person in existence. Eventually, Dante and Trish take care of Mundus, leave the island, and both run Dante's devil hunting business after changing its name from Devil May Cry to Devil Never Cry. So, as you can see, the first game in the series is chock full of ridiculous action, difficult enemies, and at times cringe humor. But this insane combination worked very well, so much so that it sits at a 94 on Metacritic to this day. So it's pretty clear that this formula was a major success for Capcom, so they definitely played it safe and just continued that for Devil May Cry 2, right? Well, if they did, then I probably wouldn't be making this video. For the second game in the series, they pretty much tore up the foundation that had been laid in the first game and did nothing to repair it. If you were somehow trapped in a room and was forced to play Devil May Cry 1 and 2 back to back, you'd probably assume that your captor was playing a prank on you when you got to DMC 2 because it just doesn't make any sense compared to DMC 1, or in general really. The game is basically only related by name and main character. Long gone is the eerie yet inviting atmosphere of Malay Island, or the wide variety of enemies that are as creepy as they are interesting, or even the difficult boss encounters that give the player a sense of accomplishment upon defeating. What you're given is a shameful attempt at continuing a newly established franchise that lacks the soul, humor, and absurdity of the original. But none of this matters if you haven't experienced DMC 2, so let's actually dive deep into this interesting game that left me with mixed feelings, starting with the story. As soon as you boot up the game, you're greeted with a screen that asks you whose campaign you'd like to start with, assuming you're playing the collection version anyway, which is the most successful way to play the game nowadays. But there's our recognizable hero Dante, or a new person to the franchise, Lucia. And after a bit of online research so that I could play this game in the correct order, I saw cases for and against starting with either character, but the one thing that was consistent was that it doesn't really matter who you start with, because the story isn't the greatest, which bodes really well for someone who wants to dive into the game for the first time. So I just decided to start with Lucia since DMC 1's only playable character is Dante, so it would be a nice change of pace. So for the different character options right off the bat, I'll give it a point, but thanks to the research I did beforehand that was basically a warning about the game, I'm gonna have to remove that point. After you finally load into the game after choosing Lucia, we see her in a museum reading some plaque that mentions the legendary demon hunter Sparta, who we know from the first game is Dante's father. Near this plaque is the Arcana Medallia, which seems important, but we'll get back to that in a moment. Upon taking the Arcana, Lucia is attacked by these bird demons when suddenly a familiar looking man breaks through the glass at the top of the museum, and it's none other than Dante. He blasts through the demon birds, and he and Lucia have this weird exchange where it seems like she called him, but then she runs off saying,
"Till next time, son of Sparta."
My retelling of the story may seem a little weird and confusing, and it's because I'm trying to give you guys the experience of playing through this game for the first time. Because while things are a little more clear during his subsequent playthroughs, they still don't make a whole lot of sense. Like, Dante just crashes through the ceiling, leaving shards of glass everywhere, and it's never brought up again. You can still be a badass and clean up after yourself, and we'll never know who actually cleaned up that mess. But after that prologue scene, you take control of Lucia for the first time, and get to take some enemies to Combo City. The combat isn't as stiff as the first Devil May Cry, and even though the camera is locked for the most part, it doesn't feel as claustrophobic. So after pummeling a few enemies and getting enough red orbs to open the first door in this weird city that we're in for some reason, the cracks of the game really start to show. There are more enemies to fight, and while the combat is fun and fluid, it's missing the difficulty that you'd expect after playing the first game. Also, these areas are way too big. DMC 1 was scary because everything was close quarters and the movement was meatier, so you had to be more deliberate with your actions. Sure, it's a hack and slash, but the game discourages you from mindlessly mashing buttons because every enemy can take a big chunk off of Dante's health bar. Well, that's not the case in Devil May Cry 2. You can mash your way to success in every encounter because every single enemy can be stun locked into oblivion. Now, I did have a little bit of a game journo Cuphead moment and couldn't figure out how to leave this little arena area. Turns out, all I needed to do was jump out the window-shaped hole at the top of the structure. But while I was being bad at the video game, it gave me time to reflect on the game so far. I started with Lucia, and after the museum prologue, it seemed like nothing was explained well, like at all. I can understand if the game is supposed to be cryptic, but usually there's a certain vibe you get from cryptic storytelling, and that's just not happening here. Like, who is Lucia, and why should I care about her? If the argument is, well, you should have played as Dante first, then the game shouldn't have given me the option to play as Lucia first. But also, if that was the intended outcome, then Lucia's campaign would have unlocked after Dante's like every other video game that handles multiple story campaigns. This is only the first chapter, and it just feels like filler. The open world is nice, but it's just so lifeless. And Lucia is just wandering around the city slash island slash whatever this location is. For what? I don't know, because the game doesn't mention anything. But eventually Lucia makes it to this mansion looking building, and after fighting off some demons, she gets tackled by this orb that gives her the ability to fly. Turns out Lucia also has access to the Devil Trigger, and there are orbs in the game that will influence how the Devil Trigger acts. This particular orb, or amulet as the game refers to it as, allows Lucia to fly until the Devil Trigger is used up. So she uses it to fly all the way to the top of the building she just entered, and at the peak is the first boss of the game, the Tartar Russian. After mashing my way through the normie enemies in the game, I was hoping that the bosses would pose a challenge, and spoiler alert, they didn't. The Tartar Russian has like 3 total moves it does, and the whole stun locking thing I mentioned earlier also applies to the bosses pretty much. It's not as egregious, but it's still prevalent. Also, the Tartar Russian just like appears. There's no cool cutscene that introduces it or anything. Lucia just shows up and it's like, hey, here's a Tartar Russian. Here's its health bar. Have fun. The boss also does no damage, and Lucia can literally stand right next to it as it's attacking because its maces swing directly over her head. But after the disappointing first boss of the game, Lucia gets the second relic. Now, if you're confused what these relics are or why Lucia is getting them, don't worry, I was just as confused by this point, but luckily there's a cutscene longer than 20 seconds and with more than 2 lines of dialogue at the start of mission 3. So Lucia runs into Dante in the mansion area, and it blows up, which causes Dante to turn on gentleman mode and whisks Lucia away. When they make it down to the ground, there's this old woman named Mathieu who comes out of nowhere after being summoned by Lucia. Turns out Mathieu and her group, called the Protectors, used to fight demons alongside Sparta, and she uses this information to convince Dante to help her and Lucia find the last relic they need to defeat this man named Arius, who's planning something evil. Dante flips his signature coin that he's known for and decides to help him, so he runs off, and then Lucia runs off, and Mathieu just kind of stays there. None of them seem too worried about the building that just exploded 10 feet away from them, but whatever. So Lucia runs around more lifeless areas of this island and eventually enters a subway station where a set of weapons are waiting for her. But also waiting for her in the subway is a tentacled demoness that has a little more depth as a boss than what the Tartar Russian has, but not by much. So instead of just wailing on her, you have to damage her tentacles enough so that her shield lowers, and then you can start wailing on her. But just like with the Tartar Russian, there's no introduction, no fanfare, and kinda no reason for the demoness to even be here. In DMC 1, all the bosses had a reason to be where they were. They were sent by Mundus in order to stop Dante from ruining his taking over the world plans, and the bosses in DMC 2 are just kinda there. The setting also has the same feel of it just kinda existing. After Lucia defeats the tentacle demoness, she treks through a sewer to the city that exudes as much life as an old disc sponge that's way past its usefulness. It doesn't feel like the city should be connected to the coastal area or its adjacent ruined downtown area that Lucia just pummeled her way through. It's just kinda there. But in this city, there's a giant gorilla called Orangurera that poses no threat as a boss. It has a pretty good amount of health, so it's just tanky more than anything else. Speaking of tank, there's also an infested tank in the city that Lucia has to defeat that also poses virtually no threat to her. I will say though, the absurdity of an infested tank as a boss is a breath of fresh air. It makes you think that maybe the first 3 missions were just poorly executed and the game will start to pick up steam from here. But then you keep having other thoughts that keep overriding each other from your memory because oh my god, this tank has a lot of health and Lucia basically does chip damage to it. Eventually she defeats the tank and makes her way to this airbase facility where you can find multiple Devil Trigger abilities to add to her Rolodex of pretty unnecessary moves. But this airplane hangar is connected to an oil rig in the middle of an ocean, presumably off the coast of the island the game takes place in, which if you're wondering is called Via de Marly, which I had to look up because I think Mathieu might have said it once, but there's just so much to unpack about this game, it's hard to remember the tiny details that should be made more clear to the audience. While Lucia is hanging around this oil rig, a helicopter with an Ouroboros logo lands and out walks the main antagonist of the game, and we finally get a cutscene with some exposition. It's very surface level exposition, but oh boy is it welcomed at this point. So it turns out that Lucia is a clone created by this man, who we can assume is Arius, and that Mathieu isn't actually Lucia's mother and simply dug her out of the trash when she was disposed of. Arius then blocks the dagger thrown by Lucia, revealing a mark on her shoulder that proves she's a clone, and her real name is Kai. Arius is too looking for the Arcana so that he can summon and become one with an immortal demon named Argosax. And after basically being used as an exposition pig, Arius blasts Lucia away to some underground hellish looking place, most likely the demon world, where she has to fight a giant moth boss. For how cheesy this whole helicopter scene is, it's nice that the game filled you in on some things, like how Arius has demon summoning powers, so it's most likely him who's been sending all those forgetful bosses after you. And he actually does something to push the story along, instead of a generic, hey, we need to find this item, let's go look for this item. But our protagonist is now trapped in hell, fighting her way back to the real world, which consists of a lot of jumping and gunning this giant moth. This is the most engaging boss fight of the game so far, but the design feels a little weird. Lucia's ranged weapons aren't the strongest, except for the cranky bombs you can find in chapter 5, but they're not the most effective against the moth. Now they are very effective against the larva that the moth drops, but the larvae are more annoying than anything else, but at least they make the fight a little more engaging. After defeating the moth and all the larvae that it drops, an illuminated platform appears that teleports Lucia into this underwater area of some kind. I guess Arius's powers are pretty limited because why would he put in a wind condition in that area and not just leave Lucia in that hellscape forever? What do I know though? I don't have any demon powers, I don't know how they work, but from the outside looking in, this makes Arius seem a little soft. Anyway, in this new area, Lucia really thinks about what Arius told her about how she'll probably turn on the humans, and she kind of makes peace with the idea. But she continues to make her way back to the surface, which involves the swimming mission. These swimming missions are horrible. I hated them in DMC1 and my feelings haven't changed while playing them in this game either. And what makes it even worse is that there's a boss fight in this underwater section. DMC's camera was not made for controlling a character underwater, and while its fighting isn't as stiff as it was in the first game, it's still way too tight and slow to even translate underwater. Oh, and did I mention that this boss, the giant eel thing, just goes invisible randomly? This is where I accrued my first deaths of the campaign so far, because this boss fight sucks. I don't know if there's a certain strategy that you're supposed to employ, and my game sense is just really bad, but I didn't know what to do here, and looking up guides didn't help. I just wailed on the thing when it got close, and after a while, I defeated it. 0 out of 10, I hope we never meet again. Speaking of meeting again though, after Lucia gets out of the water and dries herself off, she ends up in this chamber area with the first boss from the beginning of the game. The exact same boss. I don't care that you looked at the wiki and found out that it has a different name and a slightly different color scheme. You cannot convince me that this isn't the same boss. Okay, I guess it's not exactly the same. There are lasers on the ground and other enemies out and about, but as far as the two-headed beast thing goes, it's exactly the same. Which is a point for absurdity, as they actually thought that they could get away with this travesty. But once again, I'm gonna take away that point for unoriginality. But after the Plutonian is defeated, Lucia is able to grab the last relic, and just in time, because this is when Dante shows up again after being gone since the beginning of the game. Lucia then hands it over to Dante because she thinks she's not worthy of the Arcana's powers, and instructs Dante to bring it back to Mathieu so she can go take care of something, and just dips. But it feels a little weird that Dante just kind of shows up here. Based on the cutscene at the beginning of the game with Mathieu, it seems like he went to go take care of Arius, but we know that he didn't because Lucia had a run-in with him. But maybe he did take care of Arius after Lucia was sent to the Shadow Realm, and if that's the case, then Dante would have mentioned it during this encounter, or I would like to think he would have. Having two separate campaigns sucks, because of course Dante's campaign will explain what he was doing while we were playing as Lucia, but I want to paint a picture of someone's first playthrough of this game, and it's clear that this story has too many holes to be fixed by Dante's perspective. But let's get back to Lucia. The business that Lucia needed to take care of involved meeting with Arius at his high-rise, where we see Lucia disguised as the other clone, and then reveals herself to Arius. Arius calls her Kai, but then Lucia responds with,
I'm Lucia. Don't call me Kai.
and then they fight to the death. Well, not really. There's nothing really noteworthy about this fight, just like with all the other ones, so surprise, surprise, right? The whole fight amounts to Arius striking poses on the different furniture in his office while Lucia slices and dices at his health bar, and sometimes Arius summons demons to draw the focus away from him. It is a very disappointing fight, considering all the smack talk he was throwing at Lucia during their interactions, just for him to be a diva during this encounter. But after draining his health bar down, Arius zaps Lucia, hanging her on the wall in a very similar fashion to how Trish was hanging on the wall at the end of DMC 1. But the only difference is Dante swoops in to save the day there. And oh my god, is that Dante swooping in to save the day again? Dante activated Devil Trigger to get him and Lucia out of the building, where they rendezvous down at the entrance of the high-rise, after Dante just lets Arius take all the relics from him and responds with,
"Crap like that doesn't interest me. But your swan song will."
So now they need to defeat Arius before he summons Argosax. But Lucia questions how Dante plans to get into the building, even though both of them just seem to stroll in there very easily like 5 seconds ago. I mean, I guess we didn't see how they got in there in the first place because it happened off camera, but I digress. Dante runs off again, and then Mathieu teleports to let Lucia know that even though they're not blood related, that Lucia is still her daughter. So sweet. Now that Lucia and Dante have been separated for like the 4th time, it's time for Lucia to aimlessly wander around reskinned lifeless area number 7, until she stumbles upon a giant starfish looking thing, and guess who shows up? It's Phantom from Devil May Cry 1. I have extreme arachnophobia, so I shouldn't be this excited to see Phantom, but man is it nice to see a familiar face, because after fighting super easy bosses this whole time, it's going to be nice to fight a boss that actually poses a threat. Is what I thought for about 2 seconds until the fight actually began, because this follows the same theme of every boss before. It's way too easy. This fight should have been a slam dunk. Like, with the copy and pasting they've done so far in the game, Phantom could have been an easy win, but no. They brought him back from the demon world just to massacre him. Let's go ahead and add another point to the absurdity board, because the audacity is astounding at this point. But after Phantom turns into goo again, Lucia jumps into the open portal and finds herself in the high-rise. But in order to get to the top floor where Arius is, she must traverse back and forth between the demon world and the normal world while climbing her way to the top. This is probably my favorite mission of the game because the high-rise is probably the most aesthetically pleasing setting of the game, and seeing it in its corrupted form is also very visually pleasing. If I were a betting man, I would assume that they probably spent the most time designing the high-rise, and if that's the case, then it shows. Before Lucia can make it to the top floor, she runs into this 3-headed demon called Trismagia that has the most unnerving animations in the game so far, and it doesn't help that it kind of looks like Mathieu. This demon pisses me off because it's a perfect example of the glimpses of beauty this game has that's reminiscent of the first game in terms of design and atmosphere. Don't get me wrong though, it's still way too easy of a boss fight, but it's a step in the right direction. Or I guess it would be if this wasn't the second to last mission of Lucia's campaign. The fight also drags on a little too long, but it's pretty evident that beggars can't be choosers at this point. After Lucia erases the 3-headed demon from existence and traverses through the infested high-rise, she makes it back to Arius' chambers, but it seems that Arius isn't there, and it cuts to him performing the summoning ritual underground that ends up destroying the building, ending the penultimate chapter of Lucia's campaign. And then the final chapter opens up with Lucia confirming that Dante defeated Arius. Yeah. The game shows Arius performing the ritual and then immediately cuts to the aftermath of the battle that he and Dante must have had. Even if that battle does happen during Dante's campaign, it's such a weird transition that demonstrates the already poor narrative structure of the game. The scene then continues with Lucia asking Dante to end her life, since she's not actually part of the protectors of the Va de Marly, and it's his job to hunt devils, which she is since she was created by Arius. Well, Dante doesn't get a chance to do this because a portal to the demon world opens up for like the 3rd time this game. But for some reason it's surprising this time since the ritual was incomplete according to Lucia. But she doesn't actually know that for sure since she wasn't down there when Dante supposedly killed Arius and showed up in the rubble with her. I've learned at this point that it's best not to think about the cracks in the storytelling. So Dante steps forward and says that he'll enter the portal to the demon world, but Lucia with a tearful eye tries to stop him and says that she should go in his place because once you enter the demon world, you can never return, and she's disposable since she's a devil anyway. Dante doesn't care to correct her about the whole never being able to leave the demon world thing, considering he's literally been there and escaped during the events of DMC1, and instead decides to console her by telling her that she's not a devil because
Devils never cry.
But
they then flip a coin to see who's going to go inside the portal, and if it lands on heads, then Dante's going to go, but if it lands on tails, then Lucia's going in. And Dante ends up losing the coin flip, and he runs headfirst into the portal. Dante jumps into the portal, and as soon as he disappears, Arius, who now takes on a different, more demon-esque form, appears out of nowhere, and Lucia has to take him on herself. And this fight is Cheese City. All you have to do is have Lucia throw her daggers for about a minute, and that's enough to defeat the roided up Arius. It's hard to be disappointed with this fight because it's consistent with every other boss fight so far, which is easy and boring. Possessed Arius' design is pretty cool though, so I will give them that. After Lucia gives Arius the business, he tries to get into her head one last time about not being a human, but then she says nuh-uh because
devils never cry.
This corny line angers Arius so much so that he transforms into Arius Argosax, which is a very anticlimactic fight that basically forces you to just throw daggers for a bit until the demon's health reaches 0. Now, I have no problem with a boss fight demanding that the player only use one move throughout the duration of the fight, but you gotta balance the fight and still make it difficult. But I've made it very clear by this point that this game is just not difficult like the first one. So after Lucia rids the world of Arius and all the demon goo he sprayed everywhere, Mathieu shows up again spouting some nonsense about how she's sure Dante will be back and not to worry and yada yada yada. Mathieu definitely gets the short end of the stick narratively. She supposedly belongs to the group of protectors of the Via de Marly, which implies she knows how to hunt some demons, but she does nothing the entire game. You could remove her from every scene that she's in and the story would make just as much sense. But enough Mathieu talk, because remember the coin from earlier that Dante flipped in order to see who's going to go into the portal? Well, it turns out it was a double-sided heads coin this entire time. So going with what seems to be the whole theme of this game, nothing actually matters. Now it's time to talk about Dante's campaign. And if you're hoping Dante's side fills in some of the narrative holes that plagued Lucia's campaign, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it doesn't happen. Dante's campaign is 17 chapters long versus Lucia's 13, and for the most part, they both pay a visit to the exact same areas, just at different times, excluding the times where Dante and Lucia meet up for all of 2 seconds, and then both run away playing hide-and-go-seek on the island. Dante ends up fighting most of the bosses that Lucia fights, but he encounters them on different areas of the island, which implies that the demons don't actually dissolve into nothing after defeating them with either character, which is fine because you end up fighting each boss like 3 times in DMC1, so we're not new to the idea of bosses that don't actually follow the law of staying down once their HP reaches 0. But as previously stated, Dante and Lucia do end up visiting different areas during their playground games, and one of these areas is an underground catacomb area that Dante rushes to after agreeing to help Mathieu take care of Arius. But it seems that this catacomb visit only serves the purpose of hiding new abilities for Dante, as once you complete the mission, you end up back in the city for another copy and paste mission, except with a Dante skin. Now, it's not too much of a copy and paste mission because Dante does go through a different door than Lucia, and he has to use a specific devil trigger to open a different door and quickly run through that door, but the other 90% of Dante's campaign is a copy and paste of Lucia's. Or is Lucia's campaign a copy and paste of Dante's? It honestly doesn't matter at this point. However, I would like to point out that the first and really only puzzle in Dante's campaign that I just mentioned above about using the Quicksilver Devil Trigger to quickly run through the gate before it closes was impossible to figure out. Maybe it was just another Cuphead journo moment for me, but I had to look it up after running around this part of the island because how are you supposed to know that you hit this object and then need to equip a specific ability to then Indiana Jones under the gate? Maybe if the object did the early 2000s cartoon thing where its colors were more vibrant compared to the saturated world around it, then it would have been fine, but having the solution to a puzzle being discovered by brute force means without looking something up just isn't good game design. But after that dumb puzzle, Dante gets to throw hands with the tentacle demoness and then does a sweet jump with a motorcycle, so at least that's cool. Dante then ends up in the city area where Lucia fought the infested tank, And what do you know? Dante too gets to fight the infested tank. And it's just as tanky as it was earlier. But that's not all, because Dante can't just fight one tank. No. He has to fight another tank. Oh, and did I mention there's also a third tank hanging around this interstate on-ramp for him to fight as well? This whole section was just a huge waste of time, but it did lead into what should have been an incredibly ridiculous fight, and that's with the infested helicopter. This is the type of shenanigans I would expect from DMC2 after playing DMC1, but unfortunately the hilarity of fighting a demon-possessed helicopter boss is tarnished by it just being the worst boss fight I've ever witnessed in a video game ever. First off, there's this horrible sequence where you climb up the interior of a bland building that's increasingly becoming engulfed in flames while the helicopter chases Dante. And while this would be a cool section, the fire does no damage to Dante, and the helicopter is also as non-threatening as every other boss. And then, when you make it to the top of the building, the helicopter roams around the city, forcing Dante to parkour everywhere. And by the time the chopper is somewhere stationary, you can't hit it with your sword, so you gotta rely on Dante's freedom weapons. This game has a huge problem of relying on the ranged weapons, but not centering the game around ranged weapons, causing these fights to last way longer than they should have. After Dante is done toying with the infested helicopter, he dives off the building and then runs around the city again until this phase starts warping the side of a different building, introducing the boss Nephostorus, which is a somewhat fun fight, except for the fact that it was clearly designed with gunplay in mind, especially the second phase when its head is just floating around and only stays still for like half of a second. But I really like the physical design of the boss. It's probably my second favorite design in this game right after Possessed Arius. But after squaring off with the demon, Dante heads to the helipad on the oil rig that Lucia visited, and it clears up the timeline a little bit. Dante is the second visitor here because Arius is just hanging out, which means he already handled his business with Lucia. But then Arius summons a demon to fight for him and just dips. No meaningful dialogue at all. Dante and Arius just share a quick glance at each other. Arius uses his demon powers and leaves. This is the 8th mission of Dante's campaign, and there hasn't been a lick of dialogue since he, Lucia, and Mathieu had that conversation all the way back in mission 2. But you already know at this point that the narrative isn't important anyway, so let's just talk about yet another boss fight that literally just involves the main character using ranged weapons for a little bit again. I mean, I guess with this encounter you could do the normal hack and slash thing, but why bother? I've talked about it a little bit, but the combat in this game is passable at best. It's definitely a hack and slash, and it still has all the typical combos you'd expect from a DMC game, although they're a little more clunky compared to DMC1, which is saying something because as much as I liked DMC1, it was pretty clunky. But that was part of the charm of the first game, and you can't really get away with doing it twice like DMC2 is trying to do. The combos themselves also feel a little luck-based. You can just mash your way through the game and keep performing the same basic combo, or you can spice it up by using the control stick of all things during the mashing to perform different moves. And this is definitely a choice. In DMC1, all you had to do was adjust the timing of the button presses, and that would activate the different moves. And for all intents and purposes, it worked perfectly. So it's a little strange why they chose to incorporate the thumbstick of all things in the combo process. At the end of the day, the combat is fun, but it doesn't feel rewarding, so might as well just bust out the pew-pews to drain a boss's health bar. Considering that everything is just a copy and paste between the two campaigns, I just started to run past every enemy I could at this point, because there's no reason to engage with anything. It's run around a drab area, fight a boss. Run around another drab area, fight another boss. Run around an even more drab area, and fight another boss. Dante eventually runs into this cool looking boss called Bulwark that uses these two wolves to annoy you while you chip away at its health bar, with nary a line of dialogue spoken 3 missions later. But not all is quiet, because once Dante secures the last relic and meets back up with Mathieu, she tells him to go help Lucia, but you know he has to flip that coin first, which by now we already know it's a double-sided coin, so Dante's brooding and confident stature just comes off a little cringe with this particular flipping of the coin. But hey, cringe is good when it comes to DMC, so I'll take it. So we then see the scene with Dante saving Lucia and just letting Arius take all the Arcana, as well as the scene where Dante and Lucia split once again, but this time we get to follow Dante around. It turns out that Dante did pretty much the exact same thing as Lucia and traversed around Drabsville, USA for a bit, and made it to the Starfish portal where Phantom was, which begs the question, why don't they just team up? But like with most media, a lot of Lucia and Dante's problems could be solved if they just simply communicated. But if they did, we wouldn't witness the tiny arcs that Lucia goes through. I guess anyway, because there's no reason Dante couldn't just be off to the side when Arius reveals that Lucia is a clone. But Dante then continues to traverse the high-rise through the demon world and the normal world, just like Lucia did, and eventually runs into Bulwark again. By this second encounter, you'll unlock the rocket launcher, so I thought I'd give the old grenade launcher roll strat from the first game a try, just for old time's sake. But the slow propulsion of the rocket is just too slow. I mean, you can pull off the roll, but they definitely nerfed it a bit. Not that it's needed at all due to the lack of difficulty though. And after Dante's version of the Trish Magia fight, he walks in on Arius performing the ritual. But instead of the hard cut to the ruined city like with Lucia, we actually get to see what went down. Turns out, Dante pulled a little switcheroo, and whenever he handed over all the Arcana to Arius, he actually held on to the Medallia and sleight of handed his double-sided coin in its place, which causes the ritual to fail. So Arius and Dante duke it out after Arius performs what is probably the best scream in any video game ever. This scream is then followed by a pretty mid-fight, but it is then capped off with the most badass line of the game.
King? Yeah. Here's your crown.
This is, yet again, another example that pisses me off. Because there's some good stuff hidden in plain sight in this game, and it's just a shame about the other 99% of DMC2. But anyway, Dante then proceeds to do his coin flip thing again, which is really wearing thin at this point. And then he jumps into the demon portal where he's greeted by a giant glob of a demon that's an amalgamation of some of the bosses that he's faced so far throughout the game, plus Griffin from DMC1 for some reason. This fight is just filler. You can literally have Dante stand out of sight from each demon blob and just fire rockets while all the bosses' attacks just whip right past you. It's a shame that Griffin got the even worse end of the stick when it comes to reoccurring DMC1 bosses in this game, because at least Phantom was able to move around when he was hanging around that giant starfish portal. But this Argosax filler is more than worth it when the best boss fight of the game happens, as the boss transforms into this androgynous figure called the Despair Embodied. This is the first boss that feels truly balanced for this game's combat, with giant sweeping attacks and all-around varied movesets that don't seem to follow any sort of pattern. But don't get your hopes up, because this fight is still very easy. But the weapon to the head of the Despair Embodied is a 10 out of 10. After all this fanfare, we get one last cutscene of Dante riding off into the void of the demon world and says,
"Yeah, let's go all the way to hell."
And that's the story of Devil May Cry 2. Well, almost. After completing both campaigns, you're treated to a cutscene of Lucia waiting around in Dante's shop, flipping that coin that he left behind for her. So I guess that means she did hire him way back when, but it doesn't make sense why she was acting so cagey in that opening cutscene. But I feel like I've been too negative about this game so far, so let me take a minute to talk about the stuff that I really enjoy about Devil May Cry 2. Wall running is pretty cool. And I guess the music is nice. Okay, positive time over, because even though the story is over, I still have some more gripes to talk about. So just like with the first game, there are secret missions you can find throughout the campaign, although they are a little more secret this time around, but I don't mean that in a good way. In DMC1, you would activate a secret mission by entering doors or revisiting past areas in a way that felt natural. 90% of the secret missions in DMC2 are activated by running into random objects, which made them feel like an afterthought. It doesn't help that the secret missions were also relegated to short wave-based combat missions, completely ditching some of the more fun puzzle-solving methods that the first game adopted. And then there's the Bloody Palace that unlocks upon completing both campaigns, and it's the Horde mode equivalent for DMC2. The combat in this game is not fun enough for you to dedicate your time into solely focusing on it for a poor attempt at an uncaptivating wave-based game mode. But enough of that extra stuff, because it wouldn't be a Devil May Cry game without a mandatory replay on hard mode to then unlock Dante Must Die mode. But there's honestly not a lot to say here. The higher difficulties just mean the enemies have more health and their attacks pack a more meatier punch, but not by much. The only boss fight I really struggled with on Dante Must Die was Trismagia, but it wasn't because it was difficult, it was because the fight just dragged on and on. It's kind of like the Phantom Super Boss from the first Kingdom Hearts game. Yeah, it is on the harder side of your more typical boss encounter, but the real fight is one of patience more than anything else. But after completing both Dante and Lucia's story on Dante Must Die, it unlocks a new playable character, Trish from the first game. And she's literally just a reskinned Dante from the first game. Nothing original about her. She literally uses Sparta as her melee weapon. This would be a really cool unlock if it wasn't tied to completing Dante Must Die, because I don't know why anyone would want to play this game after experiencing it 6 different times. I mean, DMC2 was released on the PS2 during the era of the cheat code, so you can unlock Trish early if you really wanted to. If you've made it through this far on this crazy roller coaster that is DMC2, then you must be wondering, what happened at Capcom for them to release a game of this quality? I mean, that's the question I had after I secured the Platinum Trophy for this game, so I did a little investigating. It turns out that Devil May Cry 2 wasn't developed by the same internal studio as the first Devil May Cry. While Production Studio 4, also known as Team Little Devils, headed by Hideki Kamiya, was working on the localization of the original Devil May Cry, Capcom tasked Production Studio 1, who is known for their work on their arcade games, to produce the second game in the series, and Hideki Kamiya had no idea that this was happening. Early reports of the game suggested that DMC2 wasn't even going to feature Dante at all, and instead would follow a new main character fighting demons throughout New York City. Which I can believe because the setting of DMC2 does give off big city vibes. But the problem was that the first director in charge of DMC2 wasn't going to have a finished product by the deadline, so eventually Hideaki Itsuno stepped in to save the day. As much as he could anyway. Itsuno was already a part of Production Studio 1 and had worked on some pretty notable titles including Street Fighter Alpha and Capcom vs SNK 2, so he was by no means unqualified for the job. But unfortunately, he was basically given sand and asked to build a skyscraper with it. And what he could do to help Production Studio 1 is eventually what became Devil May Cry 2. So after hearing all that, it makes sense why the game is the way it is, but what do we know about this mysterious first director of DMC2? Nothing. All we know is that there was a previous director, but as far as who they were or what other games they worked on while at Capcom or whatever else is completely unknown. Fortunately, Capcom thought Itsuno did a good enough job to let him redeem himself along with the rest of Production Studio 1 and produced every other Devil May Cry game that came out after 2. So it's clear that Itsuno knows how to lead a team into creating a great game when he's controlling the helm from the start. Although I will say that it's a shame that Hideki Kamiya laid the groundwork for the first game and saw his work basically be butchered by some mysterious director and then handed off to a different director that wasn't him. But he did work as an advisor for DMC3 and then went on to spearhead the creation of Okami and later founded Platinum Games, so I don't think the whole ordeal broke his spirits. But long after DMC2 was released, Itsuno would reflect on the game, stating, "There was a lot of drama over my replacing the old director, and I have nothing but bad memories about that part in particular. But basically, they said that nothing was getting done and that needed to change. The scenario hadn't been written, the cutscenes had yet to be shot, and they hadn't decided what to do about Dante's Devil Trigger. They had determined that at least the Stinger attack was essential, so at least they had someone who was going to take care of that. But none of the other attacks have been worked on at all. So it's really clear that Itsuno really tried to make something out of nothing, and I have nothing but respect for that. But this mysterious director wasn't the only person to blame in my opinion, because around the time of DMC2's development, Production Studio 1 was the arcade studio for Capcom as previously mentioned, but Capcom wasn't happy with the financials when it came to that side of the company. So Studio 1, who was proficient in creating 2D arcade games, was thrown into creating a 3D action game to help line the pockets of the execs at Capcom a little more. And I hate to say it, but Capcom was probably right in making this decision. Production Studio 1 would not only go on to produce future installments of the Devil May Cry series that helped generate a lot of revenue for Capcom, but they would also go on to produce the Monster Hunter series that is still very popular to this day. But while we're discussing money, let's talk about the sales figures for DMC2. During its run, Devil May Cry 2 sold 1.7 million units, which is around the typical unit sale for a Capcom game in the early 2000s. So while it wasn't able to top or even break even with its predecessor, which sold 2.16 million copies, it was by no means a flop for the company. The review scores for DMC2 back in the day were also very forgiving in my opinion. IGN even gave it a 7 out of 10, which means it might as well be a perfect game in the eyes of old Imagine Games Network. From that era, the review I agree with the most was the one from Eurogamer, which gave it a 5 out of 10 with the reviewer stating, "Regardless of whether you've played the original, the bottom line is that Devil May Cry 2 is a deeply flawed combat-based action game that offers a mere fraction of the depth and the challenge of the original. That's not to say it's completely terrible, because it's still a reasonably enjoyable and pretty beat 'em up while it lasts. But it's a shock to see the mighty Capcom let its standards slip in such a dramatic fashion." So, is Devil May Cry 2 a bad game? Nah, it's definitely a weak game, and it's definitely the worst in the series, but I feel like the reasons for its below average mediocrity are justified. What I can say for certain though, is that it's definitely one of the video games of all time. But hey, at least DMC2 was the best game that released in 2003 that also has a 2 in its title. As long as you ignore Jak 2, Soul Calibur 2, and Final Fantasy X 2. But if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and let me know if there's any other game you'd like me to cover.